Hi everyone and welcome back to Strike Posture Set. This is Madone. Today we're gonna talk about forward air controller Airborne. This is the same thing as a JTAC except he's flying. So the learning objective today will be to understand the mission and integration, the deconfliction, and understand the duties and workflow for the FAK. So we see the definitions, the capabilities, integration, deconfliction, workflow. Let's see the definition as always, just to grasp the concept. But the FAK is basically an airborne JTAC, and as such you have a few different skills. We will talk about that in capabilities. Here is the radio relay, so you have that line of sight advantage, so you can have longer range radio and you can transmit for medevac, C2, rotoring assets. That's something you sometimes cannot do as a JTAC because of the terrain hindering the comms. You can also provide reconnaissance with the means of the TGP. You can provide weaponry advices on some targets. You are also very efficient for providing seed because you have that ability to spot artillery. You can coordinate the suppression easier because you know the how to and when to. You also have all the harms, all those anti-SAMs munitions that you can employ. Then you can manage the deconfliction, and we'll talk about that a lot in this briefing here. The marking can be very useful when you have rocket pods with a wheelie pit or with the artillery. You can provide Tolcon from a mark. You can also generate precise coordinates with your targeting pod. Usually it will be lower than T83, so that's pretty good. You can also provide the terminal guidance for the laser bombs, for example. And provide BDA as well, because you can see what we don't from the ground. So the integration is still required, as a JTAC has to integrate the cluster support assets within the ground maneuver. You need to first show up as a FAK capable in your check-in, and you will request all the target information from the JTAC to be able to then pass it on the incoming assets if you are given the brief, for example. And all the duties will be stated during the clearance within the setup. So there are 4 of them: brief, stack, mark, control. Let's say I want to give you the brief and I want to give you the stack and mark, which is usually what we do. I will say clearance, my brief and control, your stack and mark. That means you will manage all the markings and deconfliction during the control until I tell you you are no longer responsible for it. So a little tip: in a time-sensitive situation such as troops in contact, if you are the FAK on station and you have a greater situational awareness than the fighters showing up, then you can provide support by the own ship munitions, because it will be just quicker, and don't focus on the other assets. Use your own plane also. Now for the brief, so that's just a matter of passing on the setup to the incoming aircraft and gathering the check-ins, so you can relate that to the JTAC when he's less busy, But the JTAC will always try to listen to the comms anyway, so he will try to get the check-ins himself. Then the stack is one of the most important duties for you. You will deconflict all the CAS assets from the surface fires. That includes the holding areas for the helicopters. We tend to forget those. All the ingress and egress. You need to provide the threat mitigation, so you need to know your envelopes for the threats, and you will request all the indirect fires from the JTAC to perform the deconfliction regarding all the fire missions going on with the other assets. And the mark, you can provide the mark, as I said, with smoke, for example, or laser or IR. Then you can also do the Tolcon, and you are able to provide accurate coordinates that will usually be with your targeting pod, and you are able to mark for suppression of enemy air defense. And the last one, control. Just remember the JTAC retains abort authority at all times. Monitor also the attacking aircraft to ensure compliance with the restrictions that you passed on if you are responsible for the CAS brief. That means you will have to look out from your cockpit and watch the other aircraft perform their strike. Don't focus on your targeting pod. You need to look out of your cockpit and see what's going on outside. see the attack headings and stuff, and it requires the situational awareness. You need to know where the north is and stuff, and yeah, that's a lot of work. And then you can also release ordnance by controlling yourself if you're responsible for the strike. Let's say we switched from type 1 or type 2 for type 3 because the friendlies are gone, or the enemy is moving further from the friendlies. Maybe it's a good idea to let the JTAC focus on something else and provide yourself the control for a type 3 mission. Let's talk about deconfliction, and this will be a big part of this video. So there are no best way of deconfliction, but the rule of thumb is make it easy and it will be safe. So there are a lot of words that we use, all those acronyms. They just mean that things are separated. The one we use the most is the procedural control means. It's all informal ECA, so the airspace coordination areas that we use, like CPs, IPs that are made up on the field, or the Keyhole template, the final attack headings, for example. Then you have the airspace control measures that are more formal, and those are volumes, usually pre-planned, or they can also be on the fly, like a restricted operation zone or air-to-air refueling. Then you have all the fire support coordination measures, which are no fire areas or restricted fire areas, the kill boxes or free fires areas, which are the opposite. Airspace coordination area is everything formal or informal using procedural control means. That can be stated in the restrictions if you remember to keep the aircraft from entering an airspace. So there are 3 separation types. You can go for lateral deconfliction, but that will usually hinder your line of sight, and that's a good thing if you have ADAs and they can acquire you from even high altitudes. You can use grid lines with an offset, let's say remain west of grid line 16. We also have seen the use of offset from IPs in the CAS brief. And ground to target line buffers are 1 kilometer all around the ground to target line if you have some artillery shooting at the same time. So the altitude stack vertically in priority, and that's what I recommend, is try to get your aircraft in the overhead as much as you can if the tactical situation allows so. Remember, the buffer is about 1,000 feet for anything artillery, fixed wing, together, or if it's rotoring you can allow yourself with 500 feet, and each aircraft needs to be within 100 feet to operate. That means for a flight of 2 aircraft it's 2,000 feet that you need to give them. And then you can use time, ensure the clocks are synchronized using a GPS standard time, so that's useful for SEED using TOT. So here just some pros and cons from medium to high altitude. So obviously the pros are low fuel consumptions and line of sight for your sensors and comms, and it will also be easier to navigate. If you have no clouds you will see the ground further, and you will have more airspace for the stack and maneuvers. It's also less exposure for the threats, which are usually short-range air defense, as IR missiles. And the cons, obviously, it's the radar acquisition in the clouds, if you have some, and it will reduce the accuracy of the unguided munitions. Now let's talk about Keyhole, but that will make another video, I think, with a more practical case. So you will have an echo point, which is usually the target, and just Keyhole is a fast and effective way of deconflicting multiple assets when IPs are not optimal for your target. The JTAC or FACAs says Keyhole in effect, advise ready to copy echo point. You give your grids. When you give an instruction, it will be with a distance and letter. So that letter can also be subcardinal. Let's say, for example, so you have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, which you guessed are just the cardinal directions represented by letters. When you give an instruction, it can also be subcardinal, let's say Alpha, Bravo. In this case, with this aircraft, we stack him Bravo 8. That means he's to the east of Echo at no closer than 8 nautical miles. That's the general rule here. When you give a distance, the aircraft cannot go below that distance. That works also for wheel orbits around the Echo point. You can say maintain Echo 5, the aircraft will then rotate around Echo no closer than 5 nautical miles. And you can also do some pathing with the aircraft. In this case, I say the Alpha 10 pressing by Bravo 5, which you would stay to the east of the target. But you can also make it simple and just let him choose his way, by saying, let's say he comes from the north. Here you want him Charlie 5, you can say proceed Charlie 5 by remaining Echo 5 at all times. And as a tip, a fighter jet wheel orbit is wide enough to include things inside as a gun to target line from mortars. Let's say you have 81 mic or 120 mic, that can be a good idea to include it inside the wheel orbit, and avoiding putting things lateral if you don't have to. And also be aware of the overlaps on each end of the wheel orbits. Let's say I have this aircraft at Bravo 8 and another aircraft at Alpha 8. Well, you have to understand that if they are the same level, when they come at the closest end of their wheel at the Alpha Bravo there, it will be a dangerous area. So you need to deconflict them with altitude. And that's it for the keyhole. Now let's talk about workflow a little. So as a FACE, and that's also worth for just pilots in general performing CAS, you need to save the fuel as much as you can. The fuel is life. In closer support, you want to stay on station as much as you can and use your autopilot so you can focus on the mission. And that's the one thing you need to remember on this brief. And then you can think about positioning and maintaining that mental picture by looking out, knowing where the north, the reference points are, the threads, the targets, all that, the friends, and that's also depending on your positioning. Obviously, if you're overhead, it's easier than if you're 15 nautical miles overflying an HQ somewhere. Using your helmet mounted cueing system is also very useful now for with the use of mark points, all the data link within the helmet and stuff. So use that as well. Now this is a general rule for also pilots. Just be ready to use your weapons. So prepare them. Prepare your settings for your profiles, your delivery profiles for let's say angle of impact, stuff like that. And the other thing is manage the stack actively, depending on who is going to be employed first. If you, for example, you are in troops in contact with infantry and some insurgents, you're probably going for a gun, so maybe use an aircraft with a gun and stack him below everybody else so he's ready to be used. And if you manage actively the stack and effectively, you will save a lot of fuel from all the other assets. And the FACE has to excel at this task, and I think it requires some experience as well. And when things are going a bit crazy over the battlefield, if the JTAC is under pressure, you need to really assist him in double checking everything he does without being too nitpicky. You need to make sure all the safety requirements are met. So all those things, the fan attack headings, the laser cones, friendly positions, stuff that are safety, So now let's talk about positioning. There are several ways to do it. On the left you see your overhead and the assets are passing below you to attack the target. So that's the most common way we like to do things. Then there is the 270 turns that will make an 8 figure, a bit offset from the target. That works too, you will optimize the line of sight with your targeting pod on the straights, but during the turns you will usually lose a lot of situational awareness because you have to manage your turn, and it's a bit more complicated obviously than being overhead on the autopilot at all times. And then you have this solution of flying over the headquarters or the friendly positions. For example, here's flying around the point of origin, which is kind of tricky, but possible to do. But that means you are not seeing the target, and another asset, is providing you with a real-time accurate data from for example, his sensors, target grids and stuff. That would be it for this briefing. Thank you again for watching. If you have any question, feel free to hop into the Discord and ask them or post them in the comments. And again, this is just a briefing for getting the basic theory down, but what makes a good FAQ, I think, is practice. So I'm eager to see you asking for practice on the Discord. And that's it for now. See ya.